Welcome to Kanata Connections. I'm David Watts. I am Kanata, and I, that is we. Villages of life that stretch from sea to sea to sea. A human constellation, as long as the rivers run. Kanata, Kanacha, Canadian, we are Canadian. The Kanata spirit has a yin-yang or feminine-masculine balance. It contrasts with the different mix of these elements we see in both our neighboring state in Turtle Island and an oscillation in a spread of Hispanic and Portuguese-engendered Catholic republics in Central and South America. The animating spirits of different parts of the landmass and islands of the Western Hemisphere predate the spillover across the Atlantic of so-called civilization. They also reflect ancient external populating of the Americas on the Pacific side, of which our knowledge is limited. Because our 21st century minds are so cluttered by the shards of the recent knowledge explosion, it's difficult, if not impossible, to appreciate this over millennia when the currents were slow and the depositing of bedrock was gradual and deep. So I begin this exploration 187 years ago in what were Canada's lower and upper in a British North America that was 75 years old, following 220 years as a French colony. In the last Kanata trait, that we're an evolutionary, not a revolutionary state, we saw that the closest we'd come to revolution was 1837-38, when parallel uprisings in support of self-government took place and were put down in the two Canadas. I learned about them in grade 7 as the rebellions of 1837. They were pivotal events leading to a new Governor-General asked to find out what was going on in Canada to try and prevent a repeat of the loss of the American colonies 60 years earlier. And they were pivotal because they occurred at the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria. 6 months before, a barely 18-year-old Victoria came to the throne when republicanism was on the rise in Britain. At her first Privy Council meeting, she showed such composure that her ministers said, perhaps there's still hope for the monarchy. Wanting to see her reign off to a good start and untarnished, they acted quickly to deal with the difficulties in the Canadas. Since 1837, two queens, Victoria and Elizabeth II, have been Canada's international head of state 70% of the time. These were formative years for our internal cohesion and our emergence abroad. Under Victoria, responsible government and confederation of 4 provinces came about, and 3 more joined soon after. She influenced selection of our capital. Of German ancestry, she was sensitive to the plight of minorities and chose a site on the border between French and English populations. She gave it the indigenous name, Ottawa, we say Ottawa, replacing a settler founder name. To Plains First Nations, she was White Buffalo Calf, a mythic feminine healer. Elizabeth II visited Canada more than any other country outside the UK. During her reign, we ended legal ties to Britain while retaining the crown as a spiritual symbol and developed its bilingual and multicultural character. Yet Victoria first recognized our ongoing French culture when she highlighted Sir Wilfrid Laurier as a favored prime minister at her Diamond Jubilee. Canada has more places, cities, towns, islands, parks, and streets named after Victoria than any other country in the world. We are also the only country in the world that still celebrates her birthday. For most now, Victoria Day weekend is simply a time to open the cottage or put in gardens once the risk of frost is past. As her memory eclipses in the wake of a later queen who has passed, we can enlarge this weekend's acts of looking forward to the warmth of summer to a broader recognition of the feminine in our village constellation of every language and origin. Victoria was a unique person of influence when almost all public offices were held by men. Her and Elizabeth's influence on collective consciousness in a less gender-based world is hard to overestimate. If you were to run afoul of the law and be brought to court, would you rather be faced with an image of a man on horseback, Latin America, be charged by the people, the U.S., or see the image of a benevolent woman in a court of justice? First Nations knew the difference between redcoats of the mother and the long knives of the father in crossing the medicine line. From matriarchs and longhouses, to pilgrim mothers who built the first hospital in the New World and other social services in New France, the famous 5 who won recognition of women as persons, to cabinets with gender parity and our first Supreme Court with a majority of female justices, these all reflect a deeper yin-yang balance that is the energy and spirit of Kanata. A third royal woman contributed to the Kanata yin-yang legacy. Though well known historically, Elizabeth I's influence on Canada is not known and did not occur until 170 years after she lived. Victoria and Elizabeth II were actually queens of Canada, but the first Elizabeth had no direction. Victoria and Elizabeth II were actually queens of Canada, but the first Elizabeth had no direct connection with the Canadian mainland that was New France at the time. Yet 11 years after the former New France passed to the British, an enactment of her reign became the basis of Britain's treatment of its newly acquired French-speaking colony across the North Atlantic. On first setting up in Quebec, along the St. Lawrence and south to the Mississippi, Britain's first aim was to win the cooperation of First Nations who had been French allies. This she did in the Proclamation of 1763. Britain experienced English settlers would follow and in time outnumber the French to become a province like other British colonies to the south on the Atlantic coast. That did not happen. As the 13 colonies agitated for relaxation of British control over their trade, the governor of Quebec, Guy Carleton, felt the need to offer something more substantial to win the support of French Canadians, as his predecessors had done for First Nations before the French aligned with les Fils de la Liberté, Sons of Liberty movement. He recommended the way to do this was to restore traditional French rights and practices that had been suspended in 1763, though they had been set out in the military terms of capitulation Quebec signed with the British forces in 1759 and 60. Let French Canadians live as they had done before Britain's takeover, and they'd be less inclined to go chasing after new ideas of freedom. But how to get this passed in an English parliament that for a century had lived in fear of monarchs who might try to re-establish ties to Catholic Europe and the divine right of kings? An answer was found in an act of Elizabeth I that ended strife between Catholics and Protestants that had marked the reigns of her father and siblings. Elizabeth's first act re-established the Church of England as supreme. Her second allowed Roman Catholics to practice their religion in private without harassment. "I want no windows into men's souls," she said solemnly as she signed it into law. This Elizabethan settlement spared England the Inquisition and religious warfare sweeping Europe. If subjects would pledge loyalty to her as queen, what they believed was of no concern to her. This 1559 English Act was the basis of the 1774 Quebec Act, the first legislation, as distinct from proclamation, in the ongoing written constitution of Quebec and Canada 215 years later. It is hereby declared that His Majesty's subjects, professing the religion of the Church of Rome of and in the province of Quebec, may have, hold, and enjoy the free exercise of the religion of the Church of Rome, subject to the King's supremacy, declared and established by an act made in the first year in the reign of Queen Elizabeth over all the dominions and countries to which then did belong to the imperial crown. In its 1774 application, Elizabeth I's Act of Toleration went far beyond its original scope, giving Roman Catholics in Canada rights that existed nowhere else in the Empire, including Britain. Here the Act led beyond the scope of private and even public religion to become a guardian of the distinct society in Quebec, official status of the French language, and of a bilingual Canada. The words, "I want no windows into people's souls," with which the first Elizabeth signed the Act, can also be seen as a foundation of privacy law that would be legislated 400 years later. Two Elizabeths and one Victoria, three queens with a combined span of 178 years, distilled and downloaded into the past 250 years of the Kanata journey. Find me another place on the planet with that concentrated dosage of female leadership and influence. Combine that top-down symbolic influence, and symbols matter in shaping what we become, with the strength of matriarchs and lodges and longhouses of First Nations, and Kanata has been singularly fortunate. We'll return to this when we look at our traits of connectedness and ability to accommodate ambiguity, offshoots of the yin-yang balance. For Kanata Connections, I'm David Watts.
Kanata, au long des rivières, les villages lumineux au-delà des frontières, a human constellation as long as the rivers run. Kanata, Kanata, Canadien, we are Canadian.